Right.
We're on part 2 of our video interview. I'm going to cut across here. So,
We
yes.
may duplicate some of the stuff that we said before because we're not exactly sure where we left off.
Okay, we were talking about, you were telling us a story about how you got into the Bronx High School you're the high school that you went into.
Yeah.
Sure, hoping we could hear that story again.
Well, what happened was that I was in a junior high school, a public junior high school, and for the first 2 years I was in the country. I did quite well, but my English wasn't perfect, but it was pretty good. And then we took entrance examinations to get into magnet schools in New York, and I took entrance exams to both a school called Townsend Harris, which is a very academic high school, and Bronx High School of Science. And I made it through both entrance exams. In spite of the fact that I had very poor English scores, I did very well in the mathematics, and that got me through. Anyway, so I went for a year to Townsend Harris, which was considered the best magnet school in the city. And unfortunately, the school closed after that, and I had to transfer to another high school, and I went to the Bronx High School of Science for the last 2 years. And that's where I graduated from, and they were a very gifted students over there. All of them had to pass entrance examinations. They were all interested in sciences. There was relatively little in the way of sports teams. There were a lot of clubs, but the clubs were science clubs and academic clubs of various sorts. Practically everybody who went to the Bronx High School of Science went on to go to college from there.
You had the one story on the previous high school and the 2 tests that you had to take when you first arrived.
Oh yeah.
I thought that was a good story.
The story was that the entrance examination for Townsend Harris consisted of 100 questions in English, multiple choice, and 100 questions in mathematics. And there was no pass-fail, but they had a number of places in their entering class, and so that if they had, let's say, 80 places, then the top 80 scorers would get in, and anybody below them would not get in. Well, the total score, if you got everything right, would be 200, and the cutoff was 106. Well, I scored, in the English part of it, I scored 10 out of 100, and in the mathematics I scored all 100, so I got 110, and I got into the school. But it wasn't because of a balanced production. It was because my English wasn't up to snuff yet. And I enjoyed that year at Townsend Harris. It was downtown New York on 23rd Street in the City College building. And it was a very good year, but the 2 years at Bronx High School of Science were also very good. And then I graduated there, and I graduated actually very proudly. I was 8th in a class of 313 students that graduated, which in that kind of a school was really very good. And I got a scholarship, a state scholarship, to go to NYU. And I started actually NYU in June of 1944, before the graduation date from high school. And I went to school there through the summer, and in January of 45, when I was 18, the war was still on, the Second World War, and I felt that if I enlisted, I could get into the hospital corps in the Navy, which is what I wanted to do since I was interested in going into medicine, and I felt this would give me some medical experience and tell me really whether this was the field that I wanted to go into. So I enlisted in January of 45, and I did get into the hospital corps. Then I spent a year and a half in the Navy. I did not leave the country. I went to a hospital corps school, graduated #1 in the class in a hospital corps school, and then from there I served in a naval hospital at St. Albans, and then I was eventually transferred, and they found out that I could speak and read and write German. I was transferred to the Navy Department building, where I spent about 3 or 4 months in Washington, D.C., and I translated documents for the Navy, captured German documents. And then I was discharged in July of 46. I went right back to school in July of 46, caught up with my previous class and graduated in June of 1948. And at that point, I knew I would want to get into medical school. It was very difficult to get into medical school. And even though I had very good grades, and I was Phi Beta Kappa, and graduated cum laude, I applied to 19 medical schools and only got one acceptance. And the one acceptance was in Buffalo, and that's where I went to medical school.
Did you think there was anti-Semitism involved in the?
Yes, there was. That was very clear cut. Practically all the medical schools had quotas of how many Jews they would accept in their classes. Actually, in Buffalo turned out to be a very good place for me. They treated me very well. It was a good school, and I really got a lot of enjoyment out of going to medical school, and it pointed me in the right direction. And they had a new dean over there. His name was Kimball, and Dean Kimball came from a very wealthy Buffalo family, and he was an internist, and he had not made much progress in his practice, and since he was from such a good family and it contributed a lot of money, I'm sure, to the university, they made him dean. But it turned out he became a very good dean, and he was also very liberal, and he was not at all anti-Semitic. In the first class under his deanship, there were about 25 Jewish students among the 71 entering class, and I was one of those. And apparently the board must have gotten after him after that, and the subsequent classes did not contain as many Jews as the class I was in.
Mom was in New York, and you were in medical school,
Yeah.
and you were in touch, and there was and then I think yesterday we were talking about your father and Mom's father weren't getting along so well, and there were some issues about you guys trying to keep your relationship together, and your dad had some issues about you being prepared for marriage. And
well, my father was sort of old-fashioned and European standards kind of a man, and he felt that somebody should not get engaged or married before he was ready to support a family. And so while I was still in school, this was not appropriate for me to form a serious relationship. And so he was very much against my relationship, and he actually told me to give it up. And this was in the spring, during my Easter break in 1949, and a few days after the Easter break, when I was back in school, he suddenly died in his sleep. Apparently he had coronary artery disease and angina pectoris, and that's how he died. He died at home in his sleep.
Were there like some dowry kind of issues or something?
Yes. Well, he felt that if I did go ahead with the relationship, that Margaret's family should provide money, a dowry, and of course, in this country, that even back in the 40s, in the 1940s, that was unheard of, and so it was a very difficult situation at the time. And after he died, I had, in fact, when I got back to Buffalo on the Sunday right after Easter, and I wrote a letter to Margot at the time saying that I hoped that we could somehow repair the relationship and get back together. And 2 days later, my father died, and fortunately I had written the letter, and we resumed the relationship, and in August of 49 we got engaged, and in September of 1950 we got married.
And what did Mom say about that letter?
Well, she said that if I hadn't written the letter to reassure her that I wanted to continue the relationship, that she would not have wanted to see me again. And so there was a lot of difficult situations at the moment.
So let's see. So then So now you've gone to you went to Buffalo Medical School, and you ended up in Johns Hopkins.
No.
Right? How
No,
did it go?
no. Margot and I got married in September of '50, and then and we lived in Buffalo for 2 years. And Margot got a job. She had just finished college. She went to Hunter College in New York, and she had just finished. And she had a bachelor's degree, and she was trained in both education and and literature and writing, and she got a job in Buffalo, working for a social service agency, a community place where relatively poor youngsters, especially, had clubs and activities and social services. But she got the job as a secretary over there, and she got very much involved in what they were doing at the agency, and she became friends with a number of professional social workers, and she started in the second year. We were in Buffalo. She took some evening courses at the college at the University of Buffalo in social work. When we came back to New York, in the summer of 1952, and I took my internship and residency in New York City. I took a 1 year internship at a place called Queens General Hospital and 2 years at Metropolitan General Hospital. These were both hospitals run by the city of New York largely for indigent patients. There were no private patients. It was all run by the residents in the hospital with just visits from teaching physicians. And Margot took a job in Brooklyn in a social service agency, and she was an untrained social worker, and she really wanted to go back to school, and we were talking about whether it was time to have children or not. And as a matter of fact, something happened that may be of interest. During that first year, while I was an intern, I worked every other night and every other weekend, and I had to stay at the hospital. And Margot worked 3 or 4 evenings a week at the social service center where she worked, and so we didn't see each other all that much. We lived in a small furnished apartment in Flushing, New York. And what happened then was she wanted to go back to school, and the best school of social work was the New York School of Social Work, run by Columbia University in New York. And so she wanted to go, and we had a discussion one evening, and I said, it's time to have children, and she said she really wanted to go to school, and we didn't see each other for several days, and after we saw each other again, I said, I've changed my mind. I think you're entitled to go back to school if that's what you want. And she had said, well, I've thought about it too, and maybe it's time we had children. And so we decided that she would go for a scholarship at the New York School of Social Work and apply for it. There were only 2 scholarships available, and for the whole school, and we agreed that if she got the scholarship, she would go to school. If she didn't, we would start a family. Well, what happened was that she got a letter from the School of Social Work saying, we appreciate your application and so forth, and how would you react if we accepted you in the School of Social Work but would not give you the scholarship? So that was a new problem, and we, after much discussion, we decided to write them a letter, and the letter was basically, we told them that although we don't have the money now, if she did not get the scholarship, we would try to find some way for her to attend without it. Well, she got the scholarship, and so she went to school, and this was she did that during the first year of my residency. It was a 2-year program, and so was my residency a 2-year program. And I learned a lot from the things that she did at the school, and I think she learned a lot from the indigent patients. I saw mainly Puerto Rican and black patients, and so we had developed already our liberal tendencies, and care for poor people and this sort of thing. And so they were very educational years. At the end of the first year, during the first year while she was in school, we got into some money. And what happened was that somebody, a real estate agent, his last name was Williams, had cheated my father, defrauded him out of several $1,000s in an investment scheme, and he had lost his real estate license as a result, and he had never paid up. He always claimed that he went bankrupt, didn't have the money, and so forth. Well, my brother found in the Sunday Times a statement about that he was involved in a large real estate deal in downtown New York, in a skyscraper deal. And he was not the main agent in it, but he was involved in it, and there would be a lot of money. Anyway, so we went after him, and although we couldn't get as much as he owed, my brother and I each got $4,000. And $4,000 in 1954 or 53, it was a lot of money. And so when we got that money, one thing we did, we bought a car which cost about $2,000, and a DeSoto, and a brand new car. And then we had $2,000 left over, and when the renewal came up for Margot's scholarship for the second year, we wrote to school saying that we had come into some money during the year and that we would like to let somebody else have the scholarship, and we would pay tuition for her through that year. And that was one of the things that we were very proud of during subsequent years, because I think it was the right thing to do. Even though we weren't rich, we felt that there were people that were significantly poorer than we were, and that the money should go to them. And so she got a great education there. This was a wonderful 2 years for her. And Margot was a very talented social worker, became a very talented therapist, but she also, in addition to being a very intuitive therapist, she also had fantastically good training, and that combination, it made her just a wonderful worker. And so
she always believed that MSW.
Yeah, well, yeah. Actually, I looked at it later. I think it was called the Master of Science in Social Work. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And that was she got that in '55, and then I wanted to have we had agreed that I should go into practice in general pediatrics, but somehow, I was, as I stated in my book and so forth, academics had a certain lure and certain interest, and I felt that someday maybe I would also teach pediatrics, and I wanted to get more training, and I got a fellowship at Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore, and I did a year of pediatric cardiology over there, heart diseases for children. And that was a very good year. I learned a lot about taking care of private patients, and we also saw clinic patients. We saw consultations from all over the world, from South America and from Asia and Europe. And I worked for Helen Taussig, who was a world-famous cardiologist, who is known even nowadays as the mother of pediatric cardiology. And Margot had a job at Johns Hopkins as a trained social worker, but at this point she was pregnant, and in February of 1956, which was when I was already like 7.5 months into my fellowship, we had a baby, and that was Rusty's oldest brother, Kenneth. And so it was a very eventful year, and we enjoyed it. We met a lot of people, and we never had very much money, but we really lived a stimulating, interesting life, for both of us.
And then you had a couple stories. One was, I think, with Patience Zlotniks.
Yes.
And then also, I think one story about Ken's babysitters.
Oh yeah. Well, what happened was that I had my in-laws. You know, they were called Erlanger, Otto and Hansi, and who were really lovely people. But Margot was an only child, and they wanted us to come back to live in the New York area where they lived. And I actually had a job lined up on Long Island, and with about a month to go in my fellowship, the physician who had offered me the job, which wasn't a very well-paying job, it was $100 a week, which even then wasn't very much money, and decided not to take in a partner. And so I had about 4 weeks left in my fellowship and nowhere to go at the end of that time. I had advertised for looking for a job, and I'd answered ads in the medical journals for people who wanted a pediatrician. And so I went back to that correspondence, and I got a call from a physician by the name of Sidney Davidow from Youngstown, Ohio, who said, "Are you still interested?" And I said yes, and we talked a while, and it turned out that Sid Davidow's best friend was a physician named Sam Zlotnick, whose brother was Jules Zlotnick, who was a lawyer in Youngstown. Jules Zlotnick and Helene, his wife, had a young girl who was 2 years old at the time, who had a very severe congenital heart abnormality. And she had been seen at Johns Hopkins under the supervision of Dr. Tausig, and so Sidney Davidow called up Jules and said, "When you were in Baltimore, did you meet Dr. Wagner?" And they said, "Well, he's the one that took care of us the last time we were there." And they said, "Well, what did you think of him?" They said, "Well, he was very good, and he took good care of us. He seemed very knowledgeable," and so forth. And the Zlotnicks were very anxious for us to come to Youngstown, because there was nobody in Youngstown who had special training in pediatric cardiology. And so Sid Davidow asked me to come and visit him in Youngstown, and Margot and I said, well, we only had one free weekend left before the end of my fellowship, but we had no other significant prospects, so we said, all right, we'll go. Now at that point, this was about beginning of June of 1956, maybe end of May, and so Ken, our baby, was only about 3.5 months old, and we had a girl that came in once a week for a few hours to help clean the place. She was an African-American girl, and we figured this was going to be a business weekend, and we asked her whether she would take care of Ken during that weekend, and she would. And so we went off to Youngstown, Ohio, and I spent the weekend with Sid Davidow. And at the end, by Sunday, when I figured we had to leave, I said to him, well, are you interested in taking me on? And he wasn't sure whether he could or not. And I said, well, I don't have that many prospects right now, but if you don't give me a definite yes, I'm going to have to look elsewhere, because my fellowship is up at the end of June, and I have to have a job. So he agreed to a contract, and a couple of weeks later, Jules Zlotnick and Helene, together with the little girl Tamara, came back to Baltimore again for another follow-up visit, and he brought a contract with him, and he was very kind, and he asked me to come to his hotel room to read the contract. I looked at it, and he said, you don't have to read this. You can read it if you want to, but you don't have to, because I made sure this was fair, because we want you to come to Youngstown. And that's how it happened. And so a few weeks later, we ended up in Youngstown, and I was in practice with Sid Davidow for 13 years. And I did general pediatrics all that time. And it was very busy, and I learned a lot. And but it got to a point I was starting to see a lot of difficult patients, and so general pediatrics was no longer as appealing to me after a while as it had been originally. Meantime, we did make some good money, and we built a house in 1959. We had two more sons, Douglas and Russell.
You got to be the pediatrician for the whole community.
Pretty much, yeah. Everybody knew me. It was a city of about 150,000 when we got there, 145,000. But then
you had a lot of peers with kids our age.
Oh yeah, it was very pleasant, and it was very successful. And then in 1969, I left the practice and I decided to do only consultation work. And that worked out partially because I was just overwhelmed with the other practice, and I didn't have time anymore to see really difficult patients because there was such a large practice. And then the consultation practice also became overwhelming. I was by myself. I didn't have a partner.
Wasn't that a little scary at first to be branching out into the consultation and leaving a practice to do something that was kind of uncommon at the time?
Oh yeah, everybody had warned me that I wouldn't make a living at it, and the first few months it was really hard to get started.
It was before neonatology was really...
Yeah, well, the neonatology came later. Then I did general pediatric consultations for 2 years, from 1969 to 71, and then in 71 I was hired by St. Elizabeth's Hospital, which is was at that time one of the two general hospitals in Youngstown, and I ran their pediatric department, and I built up their newborn intensive care unit, which I became very interested in. They did lots of consultation work. They served on every committee that had any pediatric input, the teaching of interns, and got involved in all kinds of activities over there. I ran a poison control center. There was no end to the activities, and I was spending 70 hours a week at the hospital, and I asked them to get me additional full-time help if they wanted to continue the pediatric program, and for one reason or another, the administration never got me that help. And so I started looking around to make another change. In 1976, the other general hospital, which at that time was called the Youngstown Hospital Association, took a former nurses' residence building and converted it into a children's hospital. And there was only one full-time pediatrician in that children's hospital, and his name was Bill, and Bill and I, Bill Dodson, yeah, Bill Dodson, and Bill and Bill and I got along well, and they hired me, and then I was actually I served on that staff from 77 until 2007 for 30 years. Until that hospital closed.
When did neonatology come into more mainstream?
Well, I got very interested in neonatology about 1971, and I got involved with a very well-known neonatologist from Cleveland, whom was also Jewish and from former South African, a very nice guy, and I spent some time in his neonatal unit. I went for a period of several months. I would go up on Monday morning, early Monday morning, to his unit, stay over there, work all day with him, stay overnight so that I would see what's happening at night with the patients, and then Tuesday afternoon go back to Youngstown, work all day Wednesday in the hospital, in my hospital job, Thursday morning back to Cleveland till Friday afternoon, and then work the weekend at the hospital again. And it was a 7-day affair, but I learned a lot and I became very interested, and eventually with the recommendation of the people in Cleveland, I took my boards in neonatology, and passed them in 1977. And that, so I really got interested in that. And then Bill Dodson and I ran the newborn unit together for a long time, and eventually I became director of it, and I directed it for about 20 years. And but I did, again, it was a small children's hospital, and I did all kinds of stuff there. You know, I worked in the clinic, I did consultation work, I did all kinds of referred patients, and so it, again, multitasking and all kinds of stuff. And that's when I also wrote my book about my career. And then eventually, of course, we all get older, and there were many changes that occurred in the hospital. In about 1980, maybe 81, and I served on the medical advisory board of the. I was asked to serve on that in Cleveland, of the Cleveland Genetics Center. And the reason why they asked me was because everybody in Cleveland, when they thought about pediatrics in Youngstown, they thought of Kurt Wagner, because I used to go up there from time to time and talk to them about cases and go over things with them. And so those people all knew me, and so they wanted to have a regional genetics center, and they felt that if they had input from the region, not just from Cleveland, this would be helpful to them, and they asked me to serve on this advisory board. So I did. And the advisory board didn't do a great deal. We actually only met twice a year. We had dinner, and we went over some of the work that they did and approved it and adjourned for another 6 months. So we didn't do much. But then one time, about in the early 80s, I got a call from the director of the genetics center over there, and he said, "How would you like to have a unit in Youngstown?" And I said, "Well, I can't make that decision, but it sounds very good. I will go over it with administration and see if they're interested," and so forth. And I said, "Well, who's going to run it?" And they said, "Oh, Kurt, you're going to run it." And I said, "Well, I'm not really prepared to run a genetics center. I don't have that much experience in genetics, and I happen to have special training in it," and so on. "Oh, but you can do it. You've had so much other experience. You can manage it." Well, we put the center there, and I hired a woman who also was not trained in genetics, but was interested as a nurse assistant in the unit, and we started seeing some cases. And I went up to Cleveland a number of times at these genetic conferences, and I read books and I studied and got more and more interested in it. And then by 1983, we became somewhat independent, and in 84, I was ready to take my boards in genetics, and I did, and I passed it. And so now I was a geneticist as well. And Margaret always said that shortly thereafter, she said, "You know, stick with genetics, because the day is going to come when you're not going to want to get up in the middle of the night anymore to see sick babies, and you're going to be older, and you won't be able to do it anymore, and genetics is a daytime job. You don't have work nights and weekends," and so forth. And she was, of course, right, as she was about most things in the world.
So you've had 4 sets of boards. You got family practice, pediatrics, genetics, and neonatology.
Yeah, right.
And then with time, things kind of have had a way to fall in place at different times. You kept going with the genetics, and
yeah. Well, what happened was that as time went on, in the late 90s. Now, you have to remember, I was born in 27, so in the late 90s I was over 70 already, and I stopped doing the neonatology, and they hired other qualified neonatologists to run the newborn unit, and I dropped out of that. I would go in there from time to see a patient, but basically there were other people that were running it. So, anyway, so then I was just doing general pediatric consultations and genetic cases mainly. And there was a lot of problems at the place that we called originally the Youngstown Hospital Association, of which Todd Children's Hospital was a part, was not really run very well. The administration wasn't that great, and so we eventually they decided to close down the Children's Hospital. Well, this was in 2007, and here I am, 80 years old, and the people that I've been employed with for 30 years are closing down the hospital, and I don't have a job. And so but you know, over all those years, I'd always had frequent contacts with other hospitals that were not just Youngstown. I had especially a lot of contacts with Cleveland, but I also had a lot of contacts with Akron. And Akron Children's Hospital is really a very active, growing children's hospital. And so when things were closing down in Youngstown, I called up the chairman of the Department of Pediatrics at Akron Children's, and I told him what was happening here in Youngstown, and I said that I'm available and I still want to work, and are you interested? And he said, we've just hired a new chairman of the Department of Genetics, and why don't we meet and go over things? And so shortly thereafter, we met at the medical school. Both they had a temporary chairman of pediatrics, they were looking for a new chairman, and the new chairman of genetics over there. And we met, and it was spent about an hour and a half together. We got along real well, and they had nobody else to. They were going into the Youngstown area to do pediatrics, and they were going to have a branch there, and they would like me to work there. And the only problem was they wanted me to work full time. And you have to remember, this is 2007, and I'm 80 years old, and I did not want to work full time anymore. So I told them I'd like to work 6 months a year. And we worked it out, and they gave in to my request, and they hired me. And I've been working, today is 2010, and I'm still working for them, and I work for them 6 months a year. And it's a very good relationship, and it's been very pleasant for me. I enjoy going to work, and I'm not ready to call it quits yet. I just, it's stimulating, it's interesting. The patients seem to like me. I get along well with children, whom I like children a lot. I get along well with kids generally, and so it's still a very nice thing for me to have that job.
That's great. You know what I wanted to talk more about, since Mom is in here to share her history.
Yeah.
To see if we can go back to Mom's, coming to the U.S. and more about her family that we might not know.
Well, I met your mother just before her 18th birthday, and her family came over to this country in 1938, and
she's from Stuttgart.
Yeah, she was born and raised in Stuttgart.
1929.
Yeah, she was born in 1929, and she was an absolutely beautiful woman in her youth, and if you look at the pictures, she was just magnificent. And in fact, when I first dated her, I was always kind of surprised that she was interested in me, because she was just gorgeous, a beautiful blonde, blue-eyed gal, and she was very bright, and
she had a few boyfriends.
Oh yeah, she had boyfriends
before.
Yeah.
She got in a little bit of trouble.
She didn't get to have too many boyfriends after I met her. But
well, wasn't it? She had some issues with her parents, or she was kind of left alone here and there. And
oh yeah, well yeah, and she was an only child, and she always wanted to have siblings, but her father and mother had to start working again, and after they came to this country, both of them worked. In fact, her father got into the millinery business in downtown New York, which you know, and later on did very poorly because women didn't wear hats anymore. And her mother was a very good tennis player, and she, when she first came to this country, she did part-time work as a woman that cleaned houses for other people, and part-time as a tennis instructor for the same people sometimes.
And that was Hansi.
Yeah, her name was Hansi. She was my mother-in-law was a very charming woman. You know, she really was, and she was a good person, and I kind of adored her, and both Hansi and Otto, whom you guys, the boys called Hopa, were nice people, and they loved me. They couldn't have been nicer to me if I'd been their son rather than their son-in-law.
So Mom grew up in New York. I think she used to like roller skate a lot or something.
What?
Did she roller skate or something?
Oh yeah, well she has, yeah. Well, yeah, you know, they had a car, but they never used the car very much. The car was in the garage all the time, and sometimes on weekends they would use it. And yeah, and she would roller skate to go to the dentist's office and stuff like that, you know.
Right.
Yeah, but that was before I met her, you know, when she was younger, and she actually didn't do very well in school. She was kind of rebellious, I understand, and so she didn't do well in school. And when when she got into Hunter High School, which was also a magnet school, she had to take an entrance exam, and when she got in, her mother didn't believe that she got in because she said, "Well, you're great. I don't know how you made that," you know, but she did, and she didn't do that well in high school either. But in college, she matured and she found herself. And
that was Hunter College.
She went to Hunter College, and so she was a high school senior when I met her, and I think I had something to do with her becoming more serious about things, because you know, like when I first met her, she wanted to go out with me like 2-3 nights a week, you know. And I said, I can't do that. I only go out on weekends, and because I'm a pre-med and I've got to get to med school and I got to get good grades and I got to study, so I can only see you on weekends. And she thought that was, she had never met anybody like that before, you know. And but that's the way I was, and you know, I was very studious and I was very determined. And then, you know, once she became interested in social work, she really. Well, she was a very liberal person. She was very thoughtful. She, you know, she had a good mind, and she understood people. She understood people better than anybody I had ever met. You know, and so.
A lot of intuition.
Oh, very. She was just she was a fantastic person, really, and so. It was probably, meeting her was probably the best thing ever happened in my life, you know. And she was such a fantastic individual. And later on, you know, when she got involved in all kinds of social service agencies. I mean, she ran this mental health center in Canton for 13 years.
Well, first so her parents moved to Youngstown when you guys moved to Youngstown.
A little later, yeah, a few years later.
And then Mom worked for the Community Action Center.
Yes. She worked for them for a while. She also worked for the Mahoning County Mental Health Center,
and then there was quite a bit of politics.
She worked in
corruption.
Oh yeah, she wasn't a child. Also, she was there was a child psychiatric center that she worked for.
I remember there was some type of corruption going on in the Mahoning County Mental Health Center, and she actually, it was a good time for her, I believe, to kind of step aside and go back to school. And we had a family meeting about the decision to go for her PhD. Right.
Well, what happened was that while she was working for the Community Action Center, and this came with Lyndon Johnson's law, War Against Poverty business. While she was working for them, they had speakers come in from Case Western Reserve School of Social Work to give a lecture here and there, you know. And she was very interested in that. And then she decided to take some evening courses. And she went, I don't remember how often she went, but and I finally said to her, you know, if you're going to start doing that, why don't you get into a program and get a PhD? And so it was basically my idea. And but once she got used to the idea, she went for it, you know, and she, as usual, she got a fellowship, you know.
She wrote a dissertation.
Yeah, and she ended up in a very small group, 5 people in the PhD program. She was one of the 5, and she was the only American in it.
And her dissertation was on like social policy and administration.
Well, yeah, her degree was in social policy. Her dissertation was on the interaction between the boards, individual mental health center boards, and the state boards that are involved with mental health.
And she got that dissertation paid for.
Oh yeah, it was paid for by the state, who were very interested in finding out about this stuff, and her tuition was paid for. They paid for everything, and then she visited a number of mental health centers as part of writing the dissertation, getting interviews and talking to people and finding out what was happening. And one of them was in Stark County, which is Canton, and when she apparently impressed the people in Stark County a great deal, and so they said, when are you finishing your PhD? And she told them, said, would you be interested in applying for the job of director of the mental health center over here? So she applied and she got the job, and she directed that mental health center for 13 years in Stark County.
And I remember she said she had a Vietnam vet program and halfway house and homeless and
partial hospitalization. She had all the kinds of innovative stuff going.
Psychologists, psychiatrists, social workers.
Yeah. She had a very large staff, and she always kept a very small group of patients that she counseled herself. She always had a clinical group of her own. She never gave that up. And when that job came to an end 13 years later, she had 2 offices, one at home and one in Canton. And then later on, she gave up the Canton office and she continued to see patients or clients, as you call them, until shortly before she died. And so it was, and you hate to think of things in terms of nepotism. You don't like to refer patients to a relative, but if I had, especially teenagers, I had a number of teenagers who had significant emotional and psychological problems, and they'd already been handled not too successfully by other therapists. That was typical of the stuff that I would send to her, because she was good. She really knew how, especially with adolescents, she really knew how to handle them. She was very successful with them. And people, my patients later would always thank me for referring them to her, because she was so good. And she was really the best therapist I had ever met. And I'm not saying that just because she was Margot.
Yeah.
She was good.
With a long string of very appreciative, very endeared clients.
Oh yeah, yeah. Everybody. I mean, it was hard to find anybody who would say anything negative about her.
Right. I just want to go back, way back when Mom's immigration, when her family and who came over and.
Well, I don't know all those details. I know that she came over. Her father came over first. Otto came here first, and then Hansi and Margaret followed. They stayed in England for a short time before they came here, and Hansi's brother lived in England.
What was his name?
I remember. Oops. Martin.
Okay.
Martin Kahn.
And she had sisters also. Marie.
Yes. Oh yeah. 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 Marie and Steffi. Yeah.
Right.
And they Marie lived was a divorcee, and she lived in New York, and she died in New York. And Steffi was the other sister, and she lived out on pretty far out on Long Island, in Islip, Long Island, and Steffi had, I think she was divorced, and she had a son named Klaus, and Klaus was kind of an odd individual.
Feuchtwanger.
Yeah, Feuchtwanger, right?
Lived in Hornell, New York.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They later moved to Hornell.
Psychiatrist.
Yeah. Klaus and his wife's name was Rose André, and he had met her in France, and it was a love affair their entire life. I mean, even after being married for 25 years, they were still walk down the street holding hands and being affectionate to one another. And he became very successful businessman in this country, and decided that he wanted to go into medicine. And he was in his 40s already when he decided to go to medical school. And he and Rose André and later Michel all went to Switzerland, and they all went to medical school, and all three went to medical school. And then he and Rose André came back and lived in Hornell in New York and practiced psychiatry. And Michel stayed in Switzerland and married a Swiss physician. And so that was the situation over there.
They had a close relative, friend named Aunt Sops. I remember.
Yeah, but that was not a relative.
That was a friend, close
yeah.
friend.
Yeah.
Always almost like family.
Yeah.
And then there was mom had some kind of well-known relatives, I think, too, in the beer, Rheingold. And,
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. They are related to what's her name? The one that live in Washington now, and
Birds, Rice.
no, Rice was yeah, but there was also the cousin from
Schulein?
Schulein, yeah, yes, Schulein, yeah, Marianne Schulein.
Yeah.
Marianne Schulein is still, she's younger than I am, but she's in her 70s. She's still practicing. She's a neurologist, and a very good one. And I saw her, let's see, when I was in Washington, a year and a half ago, when I went to the meeting of Stephanie's organization, and I saw them over there. And she's a very nice person. She's a cousin of Marwo's.
And who's Robert the metallurgist?
Oh, Robert is Martin's son.
Okay.
And so that's, in other words, Robert. Robert is dead now. He died, and he was Hansi's nephew.
And he was a famous metallurgist.
Oh yes, yeah, he was famous metallurgist.
And what university was he at?
I think Oxford.
Yeah.
In England.
And then okay, so mom's grandparents, your grandparents, all didn't make it to the U.S. Is that?
That's right. But Otto's mother made it here.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And Otto had a sister who lived also in New York with her husband, and their last name was Kahn. And they had a daughter who now lives in Indiana, and she taught at not Purdue, some college in Indiana, and she married a guy that also was a teacher at the college, and I heard from them about a year ago.
Well, this wouldn't be complete to not mention about the relation to Albert Einstein on mom's side. Do you remember what that was?
It's a distant relationship. I think he was a cousin of one of her grandparents.
Mm-hmm. And she had the family doctor was Otto.
Yeah, yeah. His name was what's his name Otto too? His name was Einstein also. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
And
And Otto was in business together with an Einstein that was related also in Stuttgart.
right. And mom also had some family, the Rice family.
Yeah, they were in New York. I don't know exactly the
Something in
details.
frozen foods or something.
Yeah,
Or,
there was somebody exactly. Somebody invented the process of food process. I'm trying to remember the name of it, but this goes back a long time ago. They made a lot of money. They were well to do, and so she had some pretty well to do relatives. But Otto and Hansi never made it very well financially. They were comfortable, but they weren't wealthy.
Mm-hmm.
You know.
One other kind of separate note on your side, not too long ago, about the property that was discovered in Berlin.
Oh yeah, well that's a when there's something called Wiedergutmachung, which means a restoration of property rights and so forth for Jews that lost property and so forth as a result of the Holocaust. Well, my father owned property in Berlin, in West Berlin, and after the war was over, we were told that my brother and I were told that uh, we could have access to that property, but it turned out that it was bombed out. There was just rubble, and if we took possession of it, we would have to start paying real estate tax on it, even though there was no income coming from it. So we gave that up, and a lot of people who sort of were in concentration camps and who were dispossessed and so forth and were in hiding during the war years. Those people got a lot of restoration of, and many got pensions, but we didn't get any of that. But then, when there was a reunification of Germany with Eastern Berlin becoming part of all of Berlin, we received a letter from a woman who referred to herself as a genealogist and whose father is a lawyer in Berlin, and they said that they found out that we had property in East Berlin. And well, we had no idea that that existed because I was only 10 years old when we left Germany, and my father never told me about this. And so when and they said that they could take legal action for restoration or financial compensation for this property if we gave her the right to do so, and they would, by German law, she could only collect 15% of any restoration if I were willing to do that. Well, my brother and I were willing to do that, and she went after it, and the total amount would have been a significant sum of money. We got half of it, and the rest of it is still in the courts. And the reason it's still in the courts is because the people that eventually took over the property, even though they probably got it at no or very little cost to themselves, claimed that they had renovated it and stuck a lot of money into it since, and that they were entitled to keep this, and that there didn't have to be a lot of restoration money. But we did get a significant sum for it already.
So that's still in the courts, huh?
Still in the courts, and we've written letters. My brother's written letters repeatedly asking for this thing to be accelerated, but it never has been, and I don't know if we'll ever get any more out of it.
Okay.
But we didn't talk about my brother.
Your brother.
Yeah, I have a brother, and he's 14 months older than I am. Unfortunately, he's had a bad stroke about, must be 8 months ago now, and he's not doing very well. And he after we came to America, he's lived in the New York area all his life. He worked in various businesses. He didn't finish college, but he was he worked all his life. He had responsible positions, and he worked at Globe Lighting and a few other companies. And he He's been retired for a good many years now. He's had a lot of health problems. He's married to a woman who's about 1 year older than he is. Her name is Thelma. Everybody calls her Teddy. And she comes from an Eastern European Jewish family originally, but it's been several generations in America. They have 3 children, 2 daughters and a son. The 2 daughters are both married. One lives in southern Connecticut, one lives right near them in New York, and the son lives in New Jersey, very close to New York. And
Audrey, Gary, and,
Yeah.
and Karen.
Right.
Karen's the oldest.
Oldest, yeah. Karen is the oldest. See, Karen also has a degree in social work. She got a master's in social work. As a matter of fact, she came up to Case Western Reserve in Cleveland to get her degree. She's a very nice person. Very little, very short, small person.
Mm-hmm.
And Karen has 2 sons. The other daughter has 2 daughters. And Gary has, I don't know, I think he has a son and a daughter. And in fact, the son is going to be 13 years old this spring, and the bar mitzvah is taking place in May. So that's that part of the family.
I remember there was a certain story on inheritance, and it kind of tells a little bit about Jewish background and leaving New York and your one aunt. I don't know if you want to share.
Can you shut that off for just a minute?
Yeah.